we could sort of linger on in ancient history for a long time, but I feel like we should get up to where we've got the dinosaurs. We can't not talk about the dinosaurs.
You had to say the D word.
Sorry, I know, but I mean, but one thing that you bring out really beautifully in that is, when I was 11, I was taught there were dinosaurs, they were big and slow and stupid, and then they were replaced by the mammals. And that's not the story you tell at all.
Yeah, so I'm really keen to reframe narratives like that, because there are, I think, a lot of stories that we were told when we were younger, and that unfortunately, through either just people not hearing the kind of accurate story, but also through, I think, the media, quite often they end up making it worse. They just repeat those stories, even though actually, us scientists are going, hang on, no, it's not like that anymore. And the mammal one is my own personal. I have another book actually that I wrote, Beasts Before Us, which is actually all about this subject. Because yeah, you're right. In mammals, we were taught originally that they kind of came from reptiles. And in fact, the early mammal ancestors were even called mammal-like reptiles originally. And it's just because, we didn't know better at the time. That appeared to be the case. But we now know that mammals and reptiles and amphibians, all three started very separately. They did have a shared ancestor, but that ancestor didn't belong to any of those groups. It was an other. It was a sort of proto-everything. And then the amphibians branch away from that, and then it branches again, and it's those two branches. One branch ends up leading to mammals, and the other branch ends up leading to reptiles. So they're quite separate, even though superficially we might think that some of the early mammal ancestors look a bit reptile-y. Internally in their anatomy, they really don't.
But these three experiments, these three strands of life, it's not that one comes after another. It's that they're all there. They're all finding a way to live alongside each other. Yeah,
right at the beginning, in the Carboniferous. I mean, this really is, I think, it's one of the most interesting time periods for lots of reasons. Yeah, they all three of them appear at that time and kind of go their separate ways, and yet, of course, not separate because obviously they're all sharing their habitat. And it's almost like each one has chosen, right, okay, you try not having eggshells, I'll try having eggshells, you try having warm blood, and I'll try not, it's like they all decided to give a different strategy a go and see how they got on.
So who dominated first? Because if I remember from the book, actually mammals dominated first. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay,
yeah,
that's not what I expected.
Yeah, I think most people don't. I mean, the surprising thing is, and there's been some really great recent research about this that's kind of showing it to very much be the case that when it came to the sort of the race began, that mammals actually did their ancestors did much better. They became really large. I mean, creatures the sort of size of cows, great big bulls, big plant eaters, as well as small diggers, even some tree climbers. You've got creatures with saber teeth. There's even evidence some of them might have had warmer blood already at that point. So they're basically going crazy in the Carboniferous and into the Permian. They're doing all these exciting things. But of course, the villain, as you point out, appears at the end of the Permian, which is 252 million years ago. And it basically wipes out almost everything. It's the biggest mass extinction of all time. And in the race to reclaim ecosystems and niches, it ended up being the reptiles that got there first, not through any kind of, neither one was better than the other. It's probably just serendipity, just happened to be them. And then of course that's when we end up with the time of reptiles, which includes dinosaurs.
But isn't there a little bit in there, maybe I misread it, where after the early mammals, the first mammals get wiped out, wasn't it the crocodiles who did well for a while? For a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize this. In the Triassic, which is the first time period associated with dinosaurs, the dinosaurs didn't do that well to begin with. It was the crocodile ancestors.
So the dinosaurs came third in this race.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, they did a pretty spectacular finish when they got going. Yeah, you're quite right. And among these crocodile ancestors, you've got things that look superficially like dinosaurs, two-legged creatures, standing upright, big meat eaters, plant eaters, you know, a huge diversity of animals. But then again, a mass extinction at the end of the Triassic.
Another volcano?
No, well, there's multiple things going on. One of them is a huge climate change with lots and lots of, weirdly, lots of rain. Coming from Scotland, I can sympathise. Yeah, and it basically changes the climate, changes habitats, and then there's this reshuffling again, and it's the dinosaurs then that kind of take over for a while. But of course, you know, as we know, crocodiles are still here. Mammals actually did really, really well. They were just very small and didn't become large until the dinosaurs disappeared, or the non-bird dinosaurs. I should be specific. So yeah, we're seeing this constant reshuffling of the cards. I find that really quite fascinating myself.
Well, I mean, it does at least do away with the notion that, well, they died out because the next one was better.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's nothing to do with things being better. Absolutely. And even now we talk about us being in the age of mammals. But of course, if we look at the number of species, if we're looking at vertebrate animals, well, birds, there's way more birds than there are mammals. There's only about 8,500 species of mammals, but there's, depending on who you speak to, between like 11 and 18,000 species of birds. So actually, in a way, they are kind of doing better than us. It's just that we happen to be, our group includes really big animals, so we seem to be impressed by size.
But of course, I mean, you fly the flag for the birds, but I mean, the beetles would go, that's nothing, mate.
Exactly. Beetles and fish, yeah. And of course, and then when you get down to the bacteria that have been there right from the beginning, I mean, they've got even more diversity. Yeah, the little things are absolutely the ones that rule the planet. And you can be sure that if there's another, well, we're in another mass extinction, but you can be sure if the volcanoes all erupt again and we disappear, the insects they'll just sail through. They always do.
One of the other things I liked is that the way that geology, for a biologist, you're very fair to the geologists, I thought. And I thought geologists will like this book.
I hope so. I love rocks. I mean, I have to do geology as part of my research, but I wasn't a trained geologist, but I love rocks and I'm fascinated by the stories that they tell. Yeah. And you're right. One of the things I really wanted to get across was that in telling the story of the Earth, you quite often get books that focus on the geological story or the biological story. But I hope I was trying to sort of show that actually you can't separate those either, because the way for example, the way our continents have moved have had a massive effect on the course of evolution. And there's lots of great examples of that. One of the ones I like is relatively recent, and it's that North and South America were for a long time separated from one another. And they developed very distinct animals. In South America had lots of marsupials, which we tend to associate with Australia, but there was lots in South America, and there still are. Whereas we have placental mammals in the north. And when the two countries became connected, you actually can trace in the fossil record how the ones from the south tried to move north and the ones from the north tried to move south. And you end up with this really interesting mingling, which of course we can see how that plays out. And how does each one invade each other's country, as it were. And these are the kind of case studies that we get from deep time that are fascinating to look at and give us insights into the future.
Well, I liked one of the earlier ones, which was the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea, and because I'd never come across this, that then the mammals in the northern half, which would have Gondwana land or whatever it was, and Eurasia, they created different kinds of mammals. There's one lot that I think you said led to elephants, and another one led to hedgehogs and whales, and it was such a bizarre division.
Yeah,
tell us about that.
Yeah, well, most of the mammal groups we see today, you can trace it back to the breaking up of the supercontinent, which was during the time of dinosaurs. And they tend to have ancestors that kind of come from well, I say a continent, but of course the continents were slightly different from how they look now. But yeah, I mean, that's a really good example are what we call Afrotherians. So that includes elephants, hyraxes, manatees. These are all essentially one group, and they share a common ancestor that was kind of stranded, as it were, in the Afro-Arabian continent as it split away. And we can do that for most of the groups. They tend to have sort of centers of origins in different parts of the world. One centre of origin, of course, being unexplorable, and that is Antarctica. It's the great unknown. But of course, for most of our history, Antarctica was ice-free. So there would have been thriving wildlife there.
And it was, if I'm right, wasn't it the move of Antarctica down the south and then the joining of North and South America, which changed global weather rather dramatically?
Yeah, so as Antarctica moved south, eventually you end up with this waterway that runs right round the circumpolar current that runs right the way around the planet. And this really held Antarctica cool and kind of led to it becoming this icy part of the planet that we have today. So yeah, the way that the Earth itself changes and the continents change always has a huge knock-on effect for climate, for the life, of course, that lives in it, for the distribution of plants and animals. So you can't really untangle them. They're sort of intrinsically linked together.
Do you mind if we go back to the worms? Because I always feel that Darwin liked worms, and worms often don't get much of a look in. But I did like the fact that worms are everywhere, but they're quite late on, aren't they? And I've realized that they appear quite late on, but they're everywhere. So the worm colonized the whole world, but at the speed of worms.
The speed of worms, I love it.
Come on, chaps, we can do it.
Let's go.
Thousands and thousands of miles.
So possibly the most boring movie of all time.
But heroic.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. So worms are there's so much to say about them. Darwin was fascinated by earthworms. And I fell in love with them writing the chapter about worms. They are incredible organisms, and we wouldn't have agriculture, we wouldn't have our planet as we know it without them. But they have a really bad fossil record because obviously got no bones. And of course, soft tissue doesn't preserve very well. So we have very, very few fossils. So understanding where they come from and how they evolved is very, very difficult. But one of the things we can do, of course, is look at the genes. So studies looking at the genes of different worms all over the world have really traced back to one particular key moment, and that is the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. And it looks like this is the point at which these worms become distributed in these different parts of the world and begin to develop into the different groups that they are today. But there's also a really interesting story in there that I'd really love to share about North America, because the worms that ended up in North America actually were wiped out by the ice ages. So there were no earthworms in North America, but we reintroduced them when Europeans began to colonize North America. Late. Yeah. So the worms that you're now getting in North America are actually not supposed to be there. And they are really changing the understory of forests and the ecosystems that they're moving into. And you say the speed of worms, but they're moving pretty fast. Yeah, so it's perhaps a less well-known example of invasive species.
I had no idea. So there were no worms for millions of years in North America
because of the ice. It's incredible.
It is.
Yeah. I found that particularly astonishing. And the other thing, of course, I found astonishing about them is just the size range for worms. You know, you get these tiny ones that would fit in your fingernail, but there are these giant worms that are, several feet long that you get in Australia, which look more like snakes. And I find them incredible as well. I mean, worms are just astonishing. I just got to go and read up on them. There's some great books about them, and just Google them. They are amazing.
Can we talk about, since we're on worms, can we talk about grasses? Because that's another one of the links with geology and climate change. Tell us about the story of the grasses, because they're obviously intimately connected to human story as well.
Yeah, so for all of the organisms I've chosen, I've tried to also illustrate how, because I think sometimes people think that fossils and the past, it can seem very remote and not relevant. But I've tried to show in each chapter how everything, even from the deep past, actually has a really important influence on us now and a link with us. And yes, I mean, one of the big ones is really about soil, and as we said, earthworms, but then of course plants and then flowering plants, which again, an astonishing thing that I learned as a student and have never stopped being amazed by is that we had no flowers until the Cretaceous, which was only about 100 million years ago. No flowers at all. And of course, when you then have flowers, you can start to have things like grasslands. And grass is, of course, the foundation of humankind, of our civilization. I mean, all of the major crops, you know, maize, wheat, barley, quinoa, from all the different continents, rice, they are all flowering plants. So you know, you begin to draw these threads through time. And grass isn't just, of course, interesting for us, for agriculture, but also for the effect that it had on animals. So our planet was initially, after the dinosaurs, the non-bird dinosaurs became extinct, it was quite warm, a lot warmer than it is today, but it began to cool. And we went from having a lot of forests, warm tropical forests, to having more grassland, and it began to spread, and it's now one of the sort of dominant habitats on the planet. But grasslands have then ended up shaping the animals that live on them. So things like horses, the hoofed animals, they all look the way they do because they tend to live on grasslands. So the elongated limbs, of course, it's about the efficiency of locomotion over these grasslands, but also their long faces are for browsing, and their big necks for pulling up grass, which of course is very tough and difficult. And their teeth have become much longer and have these complex grinding surfaces. So bit by bit, we see all these changes, and even their guts begin to change as they're trying to process grass. So essentially, a plant ends up kind of entirely shaping an animal. Mm-hmm. And in the case of horses in particular, that's then once again had this huge effect on our history, because the horse, of course, transformed human civilization.
But also, I mean, as the grasslands are expanding, they're breaking up the forest where forest-dwelling creatures like our ancestors lived, and then they're going to get trapped in shrinking islands unless they can climb down out of the trees and go for a long walk.
Well, that is one of the theories, isn't it, about what might have happened to us? So yeah, you're quite right. You could even say that we've got grasslands to thank for being able to walk upright and the things that we do. I mean, it's interesting. It's this constant interplay of like response. You know, things will change. Plants will change because of climate, for example, and then animals will change because of plants. And it's everything's got this knock-on effect, like domino effect. It's really quite fascinating when you start to unpick those threads.
If you don't, I just wanted to go back and talk about kelp, because it's easy to get focused on the land because that's where we spend most of our time. But there's all sorts of things going on in the sea. I mean, if we go right back, there was I forget what the creature's called, but I just called it Jaws.
Oh, Dunkleosteus. Is it the big
very
armored?
long.
Yeah, yeah, this 3 meter long armored fish. Yeah, it's a real favorite. If you
Jaws, you say that Jaws, just physical Jaws, they changed. Well, they certainly changed life in the sea, didn't they?
Absolutely, yeah, you're right. We have been forgetting to talk about the sea here. I mean, we all come from there, and of course, just because we left, it doesn't mean that nothing else has been going on since then. Yeah. I mean, the so-called sort of invention, as it were, of the jaw, it of course is one of these foundational things that changes everything. I mean, you need jaws to be able to bite. For fish, they need jaws to be able to perform that kind of suction action that you'll see on some documentaries that causes food to move into their mouths. But of course, when you start to change the architecture of the skull, you have knock-on effects on the entire body. So it is another one of those pivotal moments. And kelp's a great one to bring up, actually. One of the things I wish that I'd been able to talk more about is kelp in the book, because again, I totally fell in love with it. I mean, these are the rainforests of the sea, essentially. And also, I think what's really fascinating about them is we tend to, and perhaps I've been a little guilty of this, lump kelps in with all other seaweed. When actually the recent studies have shown that they're quite a distinct branch of their own. And you could even argue that they're slightly more closely related to us than to other seaweeds, which is really quite astonishing.
Yeah.
But they are an immense habitat on our planet, and particularly in around the Pacific rim. But then there are other, of course, seaweeds that perform similar functions off our coasts here. And yeah, I just think they're quite amazing. And of course, photosynthesis is something that we don't really even have time to cover the importance of that, of course, for life on Earth. It's really the beginning of all food chains.
Well, yeah, I mean, without photosynthesis, there is nothing.
Precisely.
Without photosynthesis, Sainsbury's runs out of food in about 2.5 days, and then that's the end of everything without photosynthesis.
Yeah, and by the end of the book, I did also, of course, want to try and bring us through into the future. And I did an event a couple of days ago where somebody was asking, whether I thought we would, what I thought the future was and whether I thought we'd be here in the future, because this book, of course, is bringing us up to the present. But it's funny, as a geologist, you do think in these, or as somebody with a geology as part of their work, you keep thinking in terms of millions of years. And I was also thinking about what you said about supercontinents. So in the book, I do talk about the fact that, it'll take X number of million years before new fossil fuels, for example, form. And then there'll be another supercontinent in around about, give or take 200 million years, maybe 250 million years. And it's interesting to kind of think about, with looking at the biography of the whole Earth, looking at our place and thinking about in another 250 million years, what place we'll occupy in that story, and whether would we be picked out as one of the organisms by a future civilization. I don't know.